primarily to help you understand what the application we filed in water court is all about. And so I brought my lawyer, Matt Kuzanovic, with me, who helped file the application. And then, as part of that application, we had to ensure that the current users under the AUG plan would not be injured, and the analysis was done by Austin Cresswell from AMAC. But before we get started on answering your questions about that application, I want to make it clear that HCB is not asking anybody to sell anything, to lease anything, to buy anything. All we're asking is that our motion to have support for the addition of industrial use to the AUG plan be supported by this group. And this group has been protected by the augmentation plan since 1997. And as you all recall, there's been a change in ownership in many of these parcels, including us. Mike Ludwig has bought parcels recently. And one of the values that everybody was looking for when they bought something was what anybody gets whenever they buy a water right, which is not only the current use, but also the ability to change the use. And under Colorado law, you can change the use of a water right, a well water right, as long as you don't injure anybody else. And the beauty of this association is that they had an analysis that said that if you bought the Box Springs water right and paid for it, what you do every year is you pay for that water right and the loan that went with it. Your pumping under your well permit would not only not injure your neighbor, but also would not injure anybody in the rest of the state. The unique aspect, I asked Matt to go back and look at the loan document, and when that loan was made and approved by the state legislature, the rate at which it was granted was not an ag rate. It was a rate that was given to municipalities and industrial users. And if you look at your articles of incorporation, it allows the Horse Creek water users, one of its purposes is to have multiple uses for the membership of the Horse Creek Water Users Association. So taking that into account, when we asked the engineer what kind of a ratio it would take if we changed from irrigation use to industrial use, he took the same factor that the state engineer approved, and by the way, the Horse Creek water users approved, when they allowed for Pricer to have 2 CFS of the Box Springs right, and the membership of the Horse Creek water users got $40,000. So that same type of analysis has already not only been approved by the group, it's also been compensated for that type of use. So based on that history, we took that same approach and came up with 2 acre-feet per acre. That's pretty conservative. I think you'll find that there's a lot of people that have been aggressively irrigating. I saw pivots running today out in the basin. And a lot of analysis done statewide is based on a shorter growing season than some of you folks have here. And you come up with a bigger consumptive use than 2 to 1 acre-feet. But if you have a question about that analysis, both Matt and Austin are here to answer those questions. So after you have any of your questions answered, I would like a secret ballot vote up or down on the following proposition, and I'll read it for you. The Horse Creek Water Users Association supports the application now filed with the Water Court to amend the decree in case number 97 CW52, that's our augmentation plan, to add as an augmented use, water used for any industrial purpose from wells operating under the augmentation plan, as long as that use complies with protective terms and conditions agreed to by the state engineer. That's the vote. Now, in advance of filing this, both Austin and Matt and I went to visit the Division II water engineer and asked him if this analysis that has been supported twice by this group would be appropriate for the addition of industrial use. And his answer was he had no objection to that approach. Matt, you were there. Is that the correct?
I agree.
Yeah. And so we took that information, we put that into our application, we filed it on October 4th. The filing meant that by November 30th or 31st, people that have an objection need to make an objection with the water court. And in my 25 years of practicing in front of water courts, the common nomenclature is if you've got a filing fee and a clean shirt, except in some of the cases here, you can get into water court. And this is not a motion to say that none of you individually can't file an objection if you have a reason to object, but it is asking that the members here add industrial use as an augmented use. Now, what's the practical implication of that? That means that if you had a contract, in our case, we've got a contract to provide water to Mustang Creek Exploration. They're going to drill a well in northern El Paso County in December. And we've got a contract to provide 550 acre feet. Obviously, they don't need 50 acre feet in December. They only need about 10. But part of the discussion we had with the state engineer was that some of the protective terms he was going to require are you'd have to dry up land that was recently irrigated, number one. Number two, you had to map out where in that irrigated ground was the ground that you were going to dry up. Number three, it had to be noticed in advance. In other words, before you started irrigating, you'd have to show how much land you were going to dry up for that year in order to be eligible to lease it to a industrial user. I know a lot of you have seen these water trucks driving up and down the road. Oil exploration, I think, is going to be robust here. I know from talking with NextGen, if they don't get the water from us or our contract ranches, they'll have to go to Kiowa. And if they have to go to Kiowa, it costs them more. So what I'm asking tonight is, in my view, common sense, which is if somebody wants to lease water for industrial use, they ought to be able to, especially since the augmentation plan was changed from a Box Springs irrigation right to irrigation plus augmentation. So when you figure out what the consumptive use of the right was, which is what the state exercise was about, then it isn't going to be any more of an impact on the basin if it's industrial use or ag use, as long as you have a proper factor. That's what we spent a lot of money trying to determine, and that's part of the application tonight. If you have any questions about that factor, Austin's here to answer it. So with that, I would ask your support of the ability to have augmentation for industrial use. Like I said, there is no requirement that you change your well to industrial use. All this does is add the possibility that if you want to do it, it'll be an augmented use. I would ask for your support and ask if you've got any questions. Yeah, Barney?
Add or change, you've used both words, so which way?
We're going to add.
Because I read on the internet on Colorado law, it says if you change it, definitely it's got to go to water court.
We are in water court. Yeah, we filed it.
So if you file in water court, then it opens up the whole thing.
No.
Can of worms.
No, it doesn't, but go ahead, Matt, you might want to.
Yeah. The proposal is to amend the augmentation plan, and by amending the augmentation plan, you can add the additional industrial use. No change of water rights to the box springs right is requested. That was already done in the original case.
So that won't open up for debate?
No, because we're only seeking to amend that decree, not a change of water rights for that. Now, anyone that's looked at the application might see there are references to changes of water rights. The references in the application to changes of water rights are just to correct locations of wells that would be used for industrial use. So I wanted to make that clear to everyone. That's separate from the augmentation plan.
If you look at it.
There's one other thing I noticed in there when I was reading it says in or out of the basin. We don't have any control out of the basin, so why would that be in there?
The contract, and Chris could go into more detail on the contract, but the contract would allow the water that's provided for industrial use to be available for oil well drilling that's located inside the Horse Creek Basin or in counties outside of the basin.
Barney, when you have an industrial use, it's 100% consumptive. That's why you need. That's
fine, but it says it can either be directly or indirectly from this county or this basin or another basin. Mm-hmm. We don't have any control on another basin, so why would we be voting?
The augmentation use.
The augmentation is for this basin only, right?
No, it's for the depletions out of the basin.
When you pump the well, we calculated an amount of depletion that occurs for the amount pumped, and that's the ratio we were talking about of 2 acre-feet of industrial use for each acre of irrigated land dried up. And
so that would be in our basin only, right?
The depletion is in the basin, and the use would occur outside the basin or in the basin. But
yeah, I understand where the use can be, but we don't have any. But the way I read it here, it says that but as far as use after it's gone, there's no problem. But we don't have any control to say that we can pump in this basin or that basin over there.
The pumping would occur in the wells that are in the basin.
Yeah, but
and then the truck.
That ain't the way I read it. Ain't the way I read it. I read that it could be here, or this basin, or another basin.
The pumping would occur from the wells in the basin, and the truck that you fill up could either be moving that water to a.
Well, I understand how to move it, but I can't figure out how we're going to be able to have any control to pump out of the basin because we don't have any control on somebody else's basin.
There would not be any pumping of water outside of the basin. I guess I probably got overly lawyerly, and what we're doing though is we're talking about you pump the well and you could fill up a water truck, and that water truck may go to a destination in the basin or it may go outside the basin.
Let me put it in terms of depletions. When you grow hay and the hay absorbs some water, the hay can go out of the basin, and that's a depletion.
Yeah, but I can't go, if I don't have enough, I can't go and cut my neighbor's floor. Contract. See, it says right here, including use associated with oil and gas, it can be inside or outside the basin.
That's the end use. That's the depletion credit.
It says summary, and it says that, and I can see where you can store it inside or outside the basin, but I don't see. Well, I read that, I thought you said you could.
Let's be clear. You have augmentation rights.
Well, I understand all of that. I just
okay. Well, what I'm saying is, the well has to get changed to an industrial use. Only the wells in the basin can have the coverage of the augmentation plan. So you do have complete control. We aren't talking about wells outside the basin.
I'll make sure, because I kind of read there, I kind of.
Well, part of the problem was that some of the wells didn't have the right location, so we had to change the wells. That's what the change is about, to show the exact location.
And all of the wells that are identified are all located in the basin.
Are those the wells that you listed?
In the application. Yes.
Are those the ones that are utilized?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Are those the wells that would be utilized for industrial?
The water, the industrial water, are you changing every well in the basin?
No.
Just the ones you listed in the decree?
Correct.
That's what I'm saying. Nobody has to do anything if they don't want to.
Where did you come up with the consumptive use numbers?
Those were from a variety of sources, and they were, I can run through a number of sources that we used. We did not want to go through individual consumptive use analysis because that wasn't done when the original augmentation plan was put together. But also we felt like it would be more convenient to you guys as an association if you could deal with one number for exchange rather than trying to compute a different number for different farms. So based on that idea, we looked at some consumptive use numbers that the USDA put together for the 4-county region that encompasses the basin. We went through and came up with some numbers based on alfalfa and turf grass, which has been the history at the HCB farms, and came up with some averages that were just over 2 acre-feet per acre. We also looked individually at the history of the water pumping out of the HCB farms. And based on that and an assumed efficiency based on the equipment that they have out on their farms, we also came up with a consumptive use of about 2 acre-feet per acre. Now, we also looked at the individual consumptive use of the HCB farm through the state consumptive use model that the state engineer uses. And over the last couple of years, which is the time period that they have on that farm, we also get a similar number. We get about 25 inches, just over 2 acre-feet per acre. So from a number of sources,
25 inches wide?
25 inches, right. 25 inches, right, is 24 inches is the 2 feet,
Right, but
2 acre-feet per acre.
You're saying you use that number that was applied?
No, not applied.
No, this is consumptive use for depletion.
For the,
Right, the application was much higher than that. So there were a number of sources, but we wanted to use a generalized approach that would apply across the basin. And we discussed this in detail when we met with Steve Woody, the division engineer. And he did not have any objections to it. He felt like it was a valid rationale.
So if we had 10-year totals of use on those individual structures that you listed in your decree, why wouldn't you use those numbers instead of 2 acre-feet per acre average?
Well, you could, but again, we were trying to do a single number for everybody.
Well,
What
we're
if
looking.
everybody doesn't want that?
Well,
Okay.
We're looking at, and we're kind of using some terms interchangeably here, like consumptive use and depletions. The augmentation plan will replace depletions from irrigation. And so we were looking at how much the plan as a whole, how many irrigation depletions could be covered by the box spring right. And we then, Austin, jump in when I mangle this, but.
Right, and let me just throw those numbers out to you too. As far as the augmentation plan, you guys have 35 CFS, okay? Now, if you were to take that 35 CFS and multiply it out over a typical 210-day irrigation season, about 7 months, which is what is typically used a lot of times for an irrigation season, you come up with over 14,000 acre-feet. And if you divide that over your 5330 acres that you guys are allowed under the plan to irrigate, you come up with 2.73 acre-feet per acre that you could augment for your depletions. Now, there's no restriction in time. You guys are not restricted to an irrigation season. and that Box Spring Right has diverted, it has a history of diverting year-round, okay? If you were to take that same 35 CFS and now multiply it across an entire year, 365 days, now we're talking about over 25,000 acre feet. If you divide that into the 5330 acres, you're now talking about 4.75 acre feet per acre, okay, that could be augmented for depletion. Those are huge numbers, okay? And again, we're not trying to say those are the numbers we need to use for an exchange program. You know, we think that the 2 acre feet per acre is realistic, but your augmentation plan is robust enough to handle that and robust enough to handle any kind of irrigation you guys want to do.
But what I'm saying is you're making an assumption that everybody does 2 acre feet per acre consumptive use, right?
Well, no, it's not just an assumption. It's how the plan operates. This augmentation plan specifically allows, and you pay dues based upon how much your individual wells were permitted to pump, rather than what your CU was.
Okay, that's the key. The decree that each individual has to pump says you can pump this much. But if you tried to get that out of the Brett Ray for what it was decreed, you'll never get that water out.
That's correct. That's why we cut it back, and we're very conservative. But tomorrow, if everybody here wanted to pump to their maximum extent, there is no prohibition about it. And most augmentation plans that I've seen usually have seasonal restrictions. They usually have quantitative restrictions. And this plan not only doesn't have that, but it wasn't based on CU. It was rather based on an aggregation of all of the well permits that became members. And as a matter of fact, the articles of incorporation have you pay dues based on what your well permit allows you to pump. So rather than attack we got to be careful here, because if you attack the basic assumption of what you guys are all paying dues on, and you go to a CU analysis, you'll all be in trouble. And so there's no reason, and that's why we went and checked with the state engineer and said, is this a reasonable approach, since you have twice before agreed to this approach? And he said yes. So I'm not going to look behind the decree. I don't think it makes any sense for anybody to look behind the decree.
We tried to stay within the scope of the depletions that are already contemplated under the original decree and make sure we're not going to add on top of that.
Why didn't you just take the numbers and everybody's going to think
Because we were looking at what folks could be doing.
comes to about a half an acre per acre.
That I don't know. Well, how do you get to the half acre foot per acre? I'm having trouble.
5,400 acre feet, with your figures that you want to figure, and that's what you're going to come out close to. Because half these people in here don't pump their wells. This district can barely maintain 5,400 acre feet. You're talking 14,000 acre feet, or it's 4 times that.
No, he's not.
I'm saying your augmentation plan could cover that. I agree that you would have a problem physically getting that out of the ground.
Now, you take every acre that we got in there, how many acres we got in there?
5,330.
Times 2, that's 11,000 acre feet. This district can't handle 11,000 acre feet. It barely handles 54.
We aren't asking for that. We're asking for 2 to 1.
Yeah, you're asking for
Yes, but
11,000
remember what the state engineer said and what your board is going to say. You have to have historically irrigated the ground, and you have to dry up historically irrigated ground. So if nobody's been pumping their farm, they're not going to be able to export any water. That's the protection you have.
You have to dry up land that you've been irrigating. And if you haven't irrigated it, you can't claim credit for it.
So this isn't mythical. This isn't hypothetical. It's the part of this motion says that the protective terms and conditions that have to be agreed to by the state engineer. And he's already told us what he needs to see. He needs to see that the land was historically irrigated. He needs to see that it's dried up. And we have to stake it. So, I mean, we could have this argument all day and all night about what the right number is, but the guarantee that everybody in this room has is that it's got to be something that was pumped recently.
More than recent, you have to have a 10-year history.
I'm sorry.
You have to have a 10-year history.
Well, 10 years is an arbitrary number. He's going to tell us whether it's 5, 10, 3, or 7. I don't know today what it is, but I do know that he's not going to let it be approved until he's satisfied that there won't be any injury.
So somebody sells their water.
I'm sorry.
Somebody, assuming this goes through, they dry up their land, and the oil play in this country goes away. Can they go back and
Yes.
reirrigate that ground?
It's a year-to-year deal where, let's say this year you want to dry up 50 acres, and you'd have 100 acre-feet to provide for industrial use. Next year you may decide you want to farm, and you can take your land back into irrigation.
We specifically covered that with him, and he said, as long as you tell him before you turn on your pumps what ground you're going to dry up, then it's administrable and it's enforceable. And you'd have to turn that into the h2o board.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to pick in the middle of the irrigation season. Well, I think I'm done irrigating. I'm going to dry up for the rest of the year and do industrial use. You have to make a decision before you start.
Question for you. If 7 people here decide to sign up their water, and it makes the rest of us go dry. Last year we was pumping air. What kind of compensation do people get who can't pump? Assuming something's wrong with the analysis, the water doesn't come in, whatever is the cause. If enough water goes out of here that it harms people's wells, how is everybody going to be compensated?
That's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Part of the requirements also is to have a monitoring program to monitor whether there is any injury to anybody.
What are they going to monitor?
I'm
Whose
sorry?
wells? Whose wells will they monitor? Well, all of them or some of them?
In the report, we've showed the monitoring wells that were all state monitoring wells that we've looked at for the last 2 years. The state quit monitoring in 2004. Since 2011, we've been checking 9 of those throughout the basin, all the way from the south end to the north. And so that's the additional requirement that the state is going to put on us, that we continue the monitoring.
Okay, continue to monitor, but the question was, if his well goes dry, because you're selling it, we're selling it, or Don John's is selling it.
Well, the monitoring program will catch it long before the well goes dry.
Okay, but what happens then? Does he get a check from you or from the board or from who?
Well, we can't injure anybody. If there's an injury, then we'll have to shut off our program.
How long does it take the water to get from the upper portion of the basin to 94?
Three to 800 years is what the movement was calculated.
Basin.
Yeah.
So your monitoring's not going to pick up anything?
I'm sorry.
Your monitoring won't pick up anything?
Austin, maybe walk through what you've done to date
As far as monitoring?
Yeah, what you look, state's data.
Back when the state engineer was working, everybody's familiar, the state engineer did a study out in the basin back in the late 80s, because there were some issues at that time with some illegal wells, illegal impoundments, and things like that. So the state engineer came in and essentially set up 39 monitor wells across the basin. These were existing irrigation wells that they went in and started monitoring, and about the same time they put in their, it's about the same time this hydro-augmentation plant came in. The state engineer continued to monitor initially quarterly and then later annually through 2004. In 2004, they stopped monitoring. I'm not sure what the reason they stopped monitoring was. But up to that time, the basin appeared to be operating in a steady fashion, if you look at the hydrographs of where these wells were. We went around, since they had stopped monitoring, we went around and tried to find as many of these original monitor wells that the state engineer had set up. Now, in a period of time that's passed since then, a lot of them have been abandoned or replaced or shut in, or a number of reasons why most of them were not accessible. But we were able to find 9 of them that were part of the original monitoring well network that the state engineer was using. So we went through and checked the water levels on those, and I can actually show you what these look like. Yeah, this may be a little bit hard for some of you to see at a distance, but essentially this is distance below ground on this axis, and these are the dark marks here. Every mark is a year, every dark mark is 2 years across here, for those of you that can't see the numbers here. But essentially, you can see the pattern. 2004 is right here, just about approximately in the middle of this. So that's about the status of things on these 9 wells, and the state engineer stopped monitoring. So we went back out here in 2012, 2013, and checked those wells, and as you can see, they're essentially flat across there. So it's, in these 9 wells, there have been no drop in water level. Okay? So these are the monitor wells, since we have access, that are part of the original network that we're proposing to continue to monitor.
So part of what our requirement will be is to continue monitoring it. And if you see, as you see, before 2004, there was one well where you got a significant drop. If we started to see that, you would have to modify the plan somehow. But I do. You want to give it up? I do want to emphasize. We're talking about 500 acre-feet of depletion. That's all the application is for, out of 1,000,001 acre-feet in storage in the basin. So if you had
Not counting Crowley County.
If you had no precipitation and no recharge from the Denver basin, and all you did was pump the water that's in storage for the next 100 years, you could still pump 11,000 acre-feet. By the way, that is what the wells in the Denver basin have found to be a sufficient level of mining to build cities on. We're not asking for that. We're asking for approval to add a use to have 500 acre-feet a year max taken out of the basin. That's it. I mean, the questions that you're asking.
If it's got that much water, how come we were all pumping air last year when it was dry? It was a drought.
What?
If it's got that much water and there's that much assurance, how come last year when it was a drought, there were several of us that were pumping air part-time?
Well, and there were other wells that were doing better because their neighbors weren't pumping. There's individual fluctuations all throughout a basin.
There's going to be variability across the basin. Some wells are going to do better than others from a year-to-year basis.
We had tales from some of the folks that the water level actually went up. You're going to have that across 100 miles.
Those problems, though, you're going to have whether or not this industrial use goes into effect. This industrial use should not have any effect on that. There's going to be some wells that are going to fluctuate over time, but this is such a small amount, and because we're doing this exchange, this should not have any effect on that.
The main thing is you're not asking to use any more water than you already use.
That's right.
You put it in this glass, or you put it in that glass, same amount of water.